From the heart of suffering, a young orphan who relies on himself named Shinpei emerges, and he becomes the hero of our story. A man from a young age, carrying his responsibilities until he became a skilled chef and traveled to work outside the island where he grew up. But life, my dear, must give us a surprise that turns the scales upside down, and that's exactly what happened to our hero. He received shocking and sudden news that made him pack his things to return to his island, where he grew up and left years ago. On board the ship during his journey to the island of Hyota, he starts to sleep and finds this girl with yellow hair in front of him, telling him to close his eyes quickly. He actually closes his eyes, and when he opens them, his vision is blurry. Then this girl tells him, "Do you remember the last time you saw me? What did you promise me?" At that moment, Shinpei looks for her and then tells her, "I remember you, but this was 2 years ago before I left." At that time, the girl is upset with him but tells him, "Give my regards to everyone and take care of my sister Mio. Don't let her die like me." Die like me? This is the sentence that struck our hero like thunder, and he starts screaming her name until she disappears from in front of him. Suddenly, he finds himself in front of another woman. When she sees him screaming, she hits him with a pen to wake him up from this headache he's having. Anyway, after a while, he finally arrives at the island on July 22nd. And here I must tell you, my dear, that the shocking news he received and the reason for his return to the island is the death of his childhood friend who grew up with him all his life. She is the same girl with yellow hair who he dreamed about, and we know her name is Oshiu. As soon as Shinpei arrives on the island, he meets Mio, the deceased sister. As you can see, she is running quickly in a hurry, but for an unknown reason she couldn't control herself and fell into the sea. After that, he pulls her out and they continue their way, and she takes him to the funeral. There, he bids farewell to his friend with sadness, and we learn that his parents died 10 years ago, but Oshiu's family adopted him and took care of him. So the three of them became more than siblings. That's why Shinpei is heartbroken over the death of his friend. While he is grieving for his friend, he hears one of the women say that Oshiu's body was dissected by a man named Hishi. Suddenly, a flash appears in the place, indicating that someone was taking pictures, and of course this was completely unacceptable. Until a man named Su runs quickly to Shinpei, crying and saying, "Forgive me, my friend. I couldn't save her. She drowned in front of me and I couldn't help her." The strange thing is that Shinpei was silent and bearing the grief because he sees everyone around him crying and breaking down over her. At that moment, he finally speaks to Su and says, "I heard that your father dissected Oshiu's body. Did she really die because she drowned in the sea, or is there something else?" At that time, So was speaking quietly, pointing to a little girl and said, "Do you see that girl? Her name is Shiori, the daughter of the owner of the Koba shopping center. She's grown up now, but she's the same girl, Ushio, saved back then. However, she's still mute because of the incident that happened to her. Anyway, I'll contact you tonight and tell you everything I found out." We then return to Shinpei, who gets in touch with Su and learns that his father didn't actually perform an autopsy. He just told the police that to speed up the burial process, but he continues and says, unfortunately, when he did a quick examination of her body, he noticed strangulation marks on her neck, which means Ushio was murdered. Of course, this was a big shock to Shinpei, but Sao explains further, saying, "That day we were on the beach behind the school, far from the tourists and the crowds. Ushio and Shiori were together, and unfortunately, Shiori was drowning. Ushio went to save her, and Mio and I jumped in after them to help, but there was no one else besides the four of us. There's no way one of us could have done something like that. But no one else knows about this except for you, me, Mio, and her father, Alan. And of course, the police didn't believe us and said it was impossible for a murder to have occurred, so they declared that she drowned." At that moment, Shinpei was about to lose it, but he thanked Sao and went to open the door. It turned out to be Mio, who brought him the necklace Ushio was wearing during the incident and decided to give it to him to keep. Afterward, she starts crying hysterically, telling him, "I will never forgive the person responsible for her death, and I have to take revenge on them." Then she leaves, and he goes to his room and keeps staring at the necklace, which, by the way, he had given to Ushio as a gift, and she had promised never to take it off. At that moment, he starts crying over his friend, unable to accept her death. The next day, things were a bit calmer. They reopened their family restaurant and started taking orders from customers until Officer Tetsu, who was a regular customer and acquaintance, came in. He then informs them that the Koba family had completely disappeared from the town. They are the family of the girl, Shiori, that Ushio saved. He continues, "Early this morning, we received reports that their house and shop were closed, and none of them have been seen. Not only that, but we also found out that their shop had a lot of debt, so it seems they ran away after the funeral in the middle of the night." The strange thing was that Mio was oddly shocked to the point where she couldn't handle it and quickly ran out. Shinpei chased after her until he reached the Koba shopping center and found her sitting on the ground, hugging herself and crying. Then he sits beside her. She says Shiori has been acting strange for a while now, even before the incident. About a week before it happened, something weird occurred when we were going to Mount Taka to catch some bugs. At that moment, she falls silent, and Shinpei asks her, "What did you see?" She replies, "Someone who looked exactly like Shiori. Ever since then, I've felt like someone has been watching me. Wherever I go, I feel like someone is following me, tracking my every move." At that point, Shinpei was confused and asked her, "What do you mean she looked like her? Was it a ghost or a figment of your imagination?" Then someone interrupts the conversation and says, "It's called the shadow." Of course, Shinpei didn't know who this was, so Mio tells him, "This is Nezu, the hunter." Nezu says, "It's called the shadow disease, a new illness we have here on the island. Not many people know about it or care about its existence, but it's real. If you're exposed to it or get infected, you'll be able to see the other shadows. Unfortunately, anyone who sees a shadow ends up dying after a while. The shock comes when he continues. The shadow kills you and then impersonates you, pretending to be the one who was murdered until it kills everyone who saw them. That's how they've operated since the days of the war. Unfortunately, there's no cure for those infected, except by exorcising the evil spirit of Hiruko. Afterward, he leaves them and walks away." Of course, Shinpei didn't believe any of it, but Mio tells him, "This is what my grandmother used to tell me when I was little. How could you not know the famous story she always told?" At that moment, Shinpei, still in shock, replies, "That was just a myth. There's no way what she said was real." She then speaks with fear in her voice and says, "I used to think the same until I saw the shadow myself. I saw Ushio's shadow 3 days before her death. We were cleaning up trash on the road." She then describes a quick scene where Ushio looked up at the sky in shock and pointed toward her sister. At that moment, they saw a shadow of Ushio that looked exactly like her, even down to the clothes. Of course, Shinpei yelled at her and said, "This isn't the time for jokes. Tell me the truth." She then starts crying and says, "I swear that's the truth." But by the time we realized what was happening, the shadow had disappeared. At that point, Shinpei was losing his mind and didn't know what to do. But he tried to calm himself so as not to scare her and said, "All right, calm down, stop crying. I'll try to handle it. But let's get in touch with Hiruko." So, Hiruko is the name of a shrine located in the northern part of the island. After a while, they arrive, but no one answers, and the door is locked. But Mio was staring at the trees in shock. Then she screams and says, "It's Shiori. I saw her there, I'm sure of it. Believe me, let's go to her quickly." So they run over to the spot as fast as they can, but they find nothing there. They were both confused and a bit scared until they heard the sound of gunfire. Shinpei quickly runs toward the sound of the gunshots and finds the woman who was with him on the ship, lying on the ground, bleeding out. At that moment, Mayo was utterly terrified and ran to get help, but the woman pulls Shinpei closer to her, struggling to speak, and tells him, "Listen to me carefully." Before she could finish, a bullet strikes her in the neck, spraying blood onto Shinpei's shocked face. Then, in disbelief, he looks back in shock to see Miyu and her shadow holding a gun to her head. Suddenly, he presses the button and her brain explodes, and the third bullet goes into Shinbi's head. He suddenly teleports and gets disoriented, returning to the beginning inside the ship. He then sees a scene from the past during the accident. We see Miyu carrying Shiori and breathing heavily, terrified. We then see Su pressing on Oshio's heart, trying to wake her up, but unfortunately, she was dead and he couldn't save her. The strange thing is that Shinbi was there, standing next to them. He saw how Su tried to revive Oshio and save her, but suddenly he gets disoriented again and finds himself on the ship in front of the woman who hit him with her pen to calm him down. She asks him, "What's wrong? You look like you were having a nightmare." Of course, Shinbi was shocked to learn that she was the same woman who had been killed a while ago. He asks her in shock, "Did you die before?" The woman tells him he's crazy, so he jokes with her. He is shocked when he looks at his phone and sees that he's back on July 22nd, the day of Oshio's funeral. He was completely shocked and remembers that on the 23rd, he and Miyu went to the temple, and the shadow killed them there. Shinbi was going crazy, not knowing what was happening. He thought he was dreaming until he opened his novel app and saw the last novel he was reading, The Swamp Man by Naguryanovsky. The story was about a terrifying event that happened in the city of Wakaya. The protagonist was murdered and was obsessed with the idea that her family had killed her because of sorcerers, magic, and witchcraft. He thought that this was the reason for the nightmare he had, but unfortunately, my dear reader, that's not the reason. We'll find find out later. Anyway, the ship arrived at the island and it was still July 22nd. He didn't understand anything. All he knew was that he was back on the island after 2 years to attend his childhood friend's funeral, but he felt like he had been through all this before. Suddenly, Miyu approaches him on her bike and the same usual scene happens. She falls into the sea. He was a little surprised, but he pulled her out of the sea and was shocked when he looked at the bike and saw that the brakes were cut. He learned about the autopsy and that she died by suffocation on the 22nd. The whole day was repeating with all its details, but this time we see the strange woman watching him, hiding among the people. Everything was repeating word for word, even the women's conversation and the flash that appeared in the place. Even Shiori was there. If Shinpei actually went back in time, it means that Shiori and her family will disappear tomorrow. If he doesn't do anything, all the other events will repeat. Sue also meets him and tells him the same things he heard before. At the end of the day, he sits down to eat with his family, thinking about what's happening. Is the shadow really the one who killed Oshio? Or is there someone else? He decides to leave them and go get some fresh air. Then he starts thinking to himself, saying, in the morning, Mio's brakes cut out for some unknown reason, but one thing is certain, she wouldn't be out on her bike with the brakes broken. Did someone do this to kill her like her sister? He was sitting on the ground unnoticed until he heard Tetsu's voice saying, "What are you doing, Mio? Where are you going at a time like this, and why are you looking back at your house like that?" Of course, Shinpei was shocked. What would Mio be doing here in her school uniform when she should be inside the house, especially since she was acting strange, silent, and staring at him oddly? Suddenly, she approached Tetsu and stabbed him in the back over 20 times, only stopping when she was sure he was completely dead. Shinpei was losing his mind from what he saw, but then realized the person in front of him wasn't Mio, but her shadow. Indeed, the shadow was terrifying, standing there coldly staring at Tetsu's lifeless body. Suddenly, a bright flash appeared in the area, a clear sign of the shadow's presence. Then, a terrifying shadow began forming on the ground, slowly taking on the exact shape of Tetsu with the same clothing. The shadow then placed its hand on the corpse, making it disappear completely. It had copied Tetsu's body and was now going to take his place among humans, with full knowledge of his personal details, so no one would suspect anything. The shocking thing was that they had planned to kill Mio today, but because she didn't leave the house, they couldn't carry out their plan. At that moment, Tetsu hands her the gun to finish her mission faster, but Mio replies, "I can't kill her today. We'd be exposed. It's better to wait and just observe her for now." Shinpei was terrified of them, and just as he was about to respond to a message from Sue, the Mio lookalike suddenly stabbed him in the neck, blood splattering everywhere. The two of them stared at him coldly, with a look of satisfaction. Strangely, they hadn't copied his body yet, but the blood gushed out so violently that his shadow appeared with its frightening eyes. At that point, Shinpei traveled back in time again, but this time he heard Ushio's voice telling him, "Be careful this time." Of course, Shinpei wasn't hearing her at all, but it became clear that it was Ushio. Suddenly, everything disappeared, and he found himself back in time again. This time, he was at the beach, returning to the date of the 22nd. He was going crazy, unable to grasp what was happening. Then he saw Mio riding her bike from earlier in the night, but this time we see the brakes break on their own. He decided to protect her, standing in front of her, and instead of her falling, he was the one who fell into the sea this time. And since he didn't know how to swim, Mio jumped in to save him. Then we cut to the mysterious woman who had been recording saying, "I've been on the island for an hour and a half and still haven't obtained any new information about the operation." She glanced at Shinpei and said, "But, as the reports indicated, unfortunately, this guy is connected to us. I will continue to observe everything, gather intel, and report back." Later on, Shinpei calls Tetsu, telling him there's been a crime in the market and a big fight. Of course, since Tetsu is a police officer, he rushed to the scene immediately. Meanwhile, Shinpei tries to focus to avoid the problems. Then he started planning for what was happening. He called Sue and told him to contact him tomorrow. He started deleting apps and pictures to free up space so he could record a video of the incident. He also put his phone on airplane mode so that he wouldn't receive any messages or calls. After that, he put his phone on the charger. Then he left the house and put his phone on video recording mode. He hid it behind a tree, facing the scene of the incident. He then entered the house and closed the door tightly so that he wouldn't die today. After that, he noticed that his right eye looked strange today, but then he found Miu's clothes in the washing machine, so he was sure she was in the bathroom and hadn't left the house. After a while, he went out and got his phone. Thankfully, he managed to record a picture of Miu's doppelganger. He quickly went to Miu's room and showed her the picture, telling her that the girl appeared in front of the house at 9 p.m. Of course, Miu was shocked and couldn't believe what she was seeing. She asked, "Who is this? How is she so much like me?" Then, Shinpei told her about the shadow and that the girl came to kill her today. Of course, Miu was shocked, especially when she saw the knife that was used and when she learned that the shadow disease was real, not a figment of her imagination. At that moment, Shinpei told her that Oshio had seen her shadow 3 days before she died. Miu focused for a moment and told him that Oshio had been murdered. Of course, Shinpei was thinking about her words and said, "I know they're cloning people's personalities. It's certain that they could be living among us right now, acting normally." At that moment, Miu became very worried and told him, "We have to save Shiori quickly. We have to reach her. We have to tell her about the shadow disease and that it's killing her friends." But Shinpei told her, unfortunately, Shiori saw her shadow, which means she'll die in a few days, if she hasn't already died. Of course, Miu was going crazy and wanted to save her friend, but Shinpei stopped her and decided to go alone so that he wouldn't put her in danger. After a while, he went to Koba's commercial center and found it closed. This was a very bad sign, because it meant that Shinpei was late, and Shiori and her family were already dead. As he was lost in thought, an old woman came up to him and greeted him. She also offered condolences for Oshio's death. Then he asked her about the shop being closed, and she was surprised that it was closed at that time since they always opened. At that moment, she took him home and kept ringing their doorbell. When she didn't get a response, she opened the door and entered the place, calling out to them. The place was completely empty, but the strange thing was that the food was still on the table, and it looked like no one had touched it. The woman continued to search the place, and Shinpei was also searching. He found the shadows on the sofa and the floor. At that moment, he knew they had been killed by Miu's shadow. And there was something strange. Shinpei's shadow was standing behind him, talking to him and saying, "Don't be surprised, this is just the beginning." At that moment, Shinpei was thinking more to figure out what happened. He took out his phone to take a picture of the shadow, but when he looked at the food and realized it was cold, he said, "This must be from yesterday and hasn't been eaten yet. That means they died moments before dinner." He noticed signs of violence on the floor, and when he compared them to the shadow on the sofa, he realized they belonged to Shiori's parents. This meant that Shiori wasn't killed here. At that moment, he decided to go up to the second floor and investigate. Of course, it was dark, so he turned on the light, but he was shocked by the strong flash that hit the place, and then the shadow appeared immediately with Shiori's voice. He remembered talking to Shiori at the funeral and saying, "Have you ever seen a girl who looks exactly like you?" He returned from his memories to Shiori's voice saying, "Why did you tell me that yesterday? What did you mean?" At that moment, Shinpei focused on her words until he heard her say, "Why were you staring at me like that? Was there something about my appearance or body?" At that moment, he knew that the one in front of him was the shadow and that she was the one who attended the funeral. He was very nervous and said fearfully, "What is this? You're talking again?" A strong shadow appeared behind her, and it looked terrifying. When he focused more, he realized that he had been suffering from the shadow disease for a long time. Before they attacked him, the woman called out to him. The shadow disappeared, and everything returned to normal. At that moment, Shinpei was shocked that he was going to die again, but the woman saved him. After that, the woman called the police to report the disappearance of the entire family. Shinpei was walking by himself, thinking about what he would do because today the forest incident was supposed to repeat itself, and he and the woman would die. But then he remembered the large bag she was carrying, which was impossible for someone who was going to spend one day. At that moment, he went to ask the security guard at a hotel, "Haven't you seen a woman like this? She's wearing a black suit, has black hair, and is wearing glasses." The man remembered her and told him that she had stayed for one day and then left. After that, Shinpei searched for her everywhere but couldn't find her until he returned to their restaurant. After that, he was about to get ready for work when Tetsuo entered the place and argued with him after catching him lying and knowing that there was no fight. But then he calmed down and told them about the disappearance of Shiori's entire family. Of course, he knew that Shinpei had entered their house today, so he decided to take his statement. At the same time, the father couldn't believe what was happening since he had spoken to Koba yesterday. Tetsuo told them that a detective from the mainland would come to investigate the matter tomorrow. But Shinpei was happy that the one in front of him was the real Tetsuo, not the shadow, and that he had been able to save him from death. Then, Tetsuo took out his phone and said, "Go ahead." He explained that it was Oshio's phone and said, "The day before she died, she came to my house and gave me her phone. She told me to keep it until you came and then give it to you. So, I'm delivering the trust." Sue arrived at the place and Shinpei decided to tell him everything. He showed him a picture of Miu's shadow and the shadow that was in Shiori's house. But Sao said, "How can you be convinced that Oshio was killed by Shiori's shadow?" But then he thought for a moment and said, "But we did find signs of strangulation on her neck and there was no one else there. This means that the shadow is the one who killed her." He asked, "Do you know how to distinguish between a real human and a shadow?" Shinpei said. Unfortunately, I don't know how to tell them apart. Sue was going crazy and said, what proves that you're human? Maybe your shadow is the one talking to me? Of course, Shinpei said. The same thing applies to you, my friend. At that moment, Mayu was going crazy and terrified, saying, what is this? What do these shadows want from us? Sao calmed her down and said, since the camera can capture them, that means they're living beings, not ghosts or demons. If they're just creatures, there must be a way to deal with them. Miyu said, what do you think about going to Hirako's temple? It's a place where they can help us with this. They're experts in this kind of stuff. They knew this information because they had been there many times, especially Shinpei, who was afraid because of what happened to them at the temple. There were a lot of shadows at the temple, and he couldn't take Miyu with him and put her life in danger. At that moment, he decided to change the past a little bit. He said, we'll go tomorrow, not today. Sue was surprised and said, tomorrow? You're forgetting that tomorrow is the summer festival. The temple is full of people from all over the country, and it's very crowded. The head priest won't have time for us, and he won't even be able to talk to us. But Shinpei was thinking that if the place was so crowded, it would be safe. He thought that the shadow wouldn't be able to kill them there. So he decided to go tomorrow, during the summer festival. But they would also create a code word between the three of them so that if anything happened, they would know if they were humans or shadows. They decided on the civilization of Mesopotamia and the word mountain. Shinpei thanked Sue for believing him even though he thought he was crazy. But in reality, Shinpei couldn't trust them as long as he didn't know if they were real humans or murderous shadows. After they agreed, everyone went their separate ways. Then we see the rain falling heavily and the world is flooded. Shinpei and Miyu run quickly to get home. Miyu said, are you going to stay with us forever? You're not going to leave, right? Shinpei was a little nervous, but he said honestly, Miyu, I was going to stay for a few days after the funeral, but because of what's happening, I can't leave and leave you. Miyu then pulled out a chain, like a sailor's chain, and said, this is Oshio's. She always wore it, and she never took it off except on the day she died. He thanked her and took the chain, completely shocked. When he got home, he kept staring at the chain in a daze. He then grabbed the phone and tried to open it, but unfortunately, it was password protected. While he was engrossed in this, Sue entered, having said the password to the gate with his sister, Toki, and Miyu. They were both wearing the yukata robes for the festival. Miyu was wearing this outfit for the first time, so she was very nervous. Sue knew that Shinpei was the one who made her wear it to distinguish her from the shadow. They were getting ready to leave. Miyu said, Oshio loved this festival. She might wake up from the dead just to attend it. Later that night, they arrived at the summer festival, which was packed with people, all happy and enjoying themselves. But let's go to the most miserable people on the entire planet. He was talking to Shinpei and said, during the 2 years I spent away from the island, I thought I would be older and able to handle anything. You know, I left them because I didn't want Mr. N to have to spend money on me while I was just hanging around. I wanted to be independent, but unfortunately, I'm still weak and can't even help myself. I feel like I'm the reason for Oshio's death. I wasn't there for her when she needed me the most. Sue yelled at him and said, are you crazy? Stop thinking that way. You're not responsible for her death. On the contrary, you're trying to avenge her. The most important thing now is to protect Miyu. But Shinpei wasn't convinced at all. Sue said, if you can't protect her, then I will, because I can't bear to lose her. The four of them gathered, and their friends started to tease them until Sue said, I got an important message from my father. After the celebration is over, we can talk to Karich, the priest. Shinpei was about to respond when he suddenly saw Oshio's shadow. He ran quickly to find her, completely crazy, pushing everyone out of his way to reach her. He kept running until he finally met her, and he was completely shocked. He kept repeating her name until she ran and hugged him, very happy. But Shinpei was terrified, especially when he saw the chain. He pushed her away and said, who are you? Oshio died a few days ago, and we even had a funeral for her. Who are you? Oshio spoke in surprise and said, dead? But I'm alive right in front of you. Shinpei was terrified of her and sure she was a shadow. He said, don't you remember what happened? Strangely, she had forgotten everything and spoke in a daze, saying, I don't know. I don't remember how I got here. Shinpei was shocked and said, you don't remember what happened to you before you got here? She put her hand on her face and said, I don't know. The last thing I remember is that I was in excruciating pain and under the water. Everything was dark. Then she screamed and said, what does this mean? Am I really dead? What am I exactly? I'm definitely not a ghost, and my feet are touching the ground. Shinpei didn't know what to say, especially since he was shocked by the shadow that thought it was the real Oshio. Oshio started to cry and said, I don't remember anything. I don't know what brought me here, but the most important thing I wanted was to see you again. Shinpei couldn't speak, completely shocked by the shadow that was acting exactly like Oshio, with all her movements and behavior, until she said, I wanted to tell you something as soon as I saw you again. She continued excitedly, I love you, Shinpei. He said, how can you love me? We're siblings. She became nervous but said, you're right. I feel like my mind is empty and I only remember a few things. Shinpei tried to convince himself not to be fooled by her words and actions, and not to forget that the real Oshio was dead. He spoke angrily and said, "What do you want? Why are you acting like her?" She said, "Believe me, I don't know anything. Shouldn't the dead be buried? How did I die and I'm still alive?" Then she looked at the fireworks filling the sky and said, "Is today the 24th? He said, "Yes." She panicked and said, "Impossible. There's something I need to do. I have to go to the festival with you and meet Miu." She ran quickly and said, "Come with me." Shinpei was going crazy because of the shadow that thought it was human and was acting like Oshio. The shadow was among the people, and shockingly, they could see her and were surprised by her clothes. Shinpei was about to faint because even if she was a shadow, she was still his friend and sister. He took her quickly to hide her from the people who would eat her with their eyes. But in another place, Miu, a shadow, reached the place and looked at the knife with the merchant with evil intentions. She kept circling until she saw Shinpei and Oshio. Suddenly, she disappeared from the place. Our dear Shinpei took Oshio to a warehouse and told her to stay there until the festival was over. He was literally going crazy, not understanding how she was a shadow and everyone could see her. Who did they bury 2 days ago? He started talking to her about the 2 years they had been away from the island. He talked to her about their past to test her memories. She answered correctly and remembered everything that had happened between them, even down to his favorite writer. The strange thing was that she didn't know anything about shadows, didn't remember how she died, or what happened to Shiori. Shinpei was confused. All her reactions were natural, and it was impossible for her to be acting or lying. Then he received a call from Mayu. She snatched the phone from him and said, "Hi, Mayu." Mayu was completely shocked and couldn't speak. Shinpei took the phone back from her with difficulty and spoke to Mayu, who had lost her voice. He said, "It's Oshio's voice, right?" He tried to change the subject quickly and said, "No, you're tired and imagining things. She's not going to get up from her grave and answer you." Miu was somewhat convinced and said, "Maybe I'm imagining things. Where are you? We've entered the fireworks temple." He spoke nervously and said, "I'm on my way." Oshio said, "What did she say?" But Shinpei sat her down and said, "Don't move from here. Stay where you are until tonight is over. I'll come get you myself." He left her and ran as fast as he could until he reached his friends. He told them the secret word so they would trust her. He was very tired from running, but they didn't care or doubt him at all. On this island, people believe that a spirit controls everything related to the sea. They call her Hiroko, the Queen of Spirits, or the Queen of Fishing. They gather all the useless sea trash and hold a ceremony where they burn it in front of everyone. This ceremony is important to them, and many people attend it. Mayu wanted to see her sister again, especially on this day, because Oshio loved festivals and celebrations. She was talking to Su, who wasn't paying attention to her. He seemed like he was up to something. Her sister was talking to Shinpei and said, "Su decided to be reckless and confess his love to her today. He's going to be sad because Miu will never love him. She already loves someone else." Su was at his wit's end and decided to confess his love to her. He spoke loudly and said, "Look, I know it's not the right time, but I still love you. I want you to agree to our love and let me protect you myself." He extended his hand to her, completely embarrassed and nervous. But Mayu was shocked and very nervous. She said, "What are you saying? You love me?" She said, "I'm very happy to hear that from you, but I'm sorry. I want us to remain just friends. Nothing more." The duo was watching what was happening until Oshio suddenly appeared. She had changed her clothes and was wearing a mask, but her hair gave her away. She approached Su and said, "You've loved her for a long time. Don't worry, I'll make her agree to you." Everyone was shocked, especially by her voice and beautiful golden hair. Su said in shock, "Are you Oshio?" Oshio was scared and said, "Oshio? No way. My name is Sarah." Shinpei stood behind her to silence her before she caused trouble. She said foolishly, "They turned out to be smart and figured me out quickly." He said angrily, "Is there anyone with golden hair like yours on the whole island?" Su moved his mouth with difficulty and said, "Shinpei, is this the dead one?" Oshio didn't care and said, "Sorry, I just missed you all. I wanted to come see you." She took off her mask as she spoke, but contrary to expectations, Miu wasn't happy. She said, "You can't be my sister. Stay away from her." Shinpei, "This isn't Oshio, it's her vile shadow. Stay away from her. I hate her." Shinpei approached her suspiciously and grabbed Oshio's hand violently. He said, "I won't let her go." He started twisting her arm, and his eyes changed shape. He said cruelly, "You were thinking about him while you disobeyed me. Do you think it's easy to appear after your funeral was held a few days ago?" Oshio was shocked and in great pain. She tried to get away from him, but he was holding her tightly. He began to distort as he said, "Why didn't you listen to me? Or can't you hear our voices?" Oshio looked at him with terror and said, "Who are you? Run away!" He twisted her arm even harder, and she screamed loudly. He said cruelly, "It's too late." Suddenly, his shadow began to appear. His appearance changed, and he smiled cruelly. He said, "Finally, it's time for everyone to die." And that's it, my friend. Today's episode of our story is over. What do you think will happen in the next episode? How will they get get rid of the shadow. We'll see that in the next episode. Don't forget to tell me if you liked the story in the comments. If you did, we'll continue it. Peace.